The summer of 1887 had turned the earth into a cracked, thirsty skin. Dust lay over Willow Creek like a shroud, soft enough to rise at the faintest breath of wind. Horses kicked it up on the main street, their ribs showing under dull hides. The water trough outside the saloon had been dry for 2 weeks. Folks were rationing what little was left from the town's well, but the level dropped every day. Eleanor Price stood on the porch of the general store, a basket of dry beans in her hands. Staring toward the horizon, the air shimmered out their heat, bending light into ghost rivers that vanished as you walked toward them. She wiped her brow with the back of her sleeve and stepped inside. The store smelled of burlap, dust, and faint molasses. Behind the counter, old Mr. Hobbs shook his head. As she set the basket down, "Won't be much left if the rain don't come soon," he said. Eleanor didn't answer. She'd heard that same line from half the town this week. When she stepped back into the street, she caught sight of Sheriff Callahan walking toward the jailhouse, his jaw tight, boots striking the boards in short, deliberate steps. In a town this small, a man's walk could tell you everything you needed to know. And Callahan's walk right now meant trouble. She followed at a distance. The jailhouse stood at the far end of Main Street, squat and sun-bleached, with iron bars that glimmered dull in the heat. She stopped in the doorway when she saw who sat behind those bars: Thomas Reed. Even in the dim light, she recognized him instantly. His face was leaner than the last time she'd seen it 5 years ago in the courtroom, when she'd sworn under oath that she saw him raise the gun that killed her husband. His hair was longer now, a streak of silver running through it. His eyes, though, they were the same, steady, unreadable. "What's he doing here?" Eleanor's voice came out tighter than she intended. Callahan turned to her. "Stage from Yuma brought him yesterday. County's moving prisoners around cause of the flooding down south." She let out a dry laugh, bitter as desert sage. "Flooding. Must be nice somewhere." Callahan hesitated, then glanced toward Thomas. "He claims he knows where to find a spring in the Red Mesa. Says it could keep Willow Creek alive till the rains." Eleanor stiffened. "And you believe him?" "I believe he's the only one who's been that deep in those canyons and lived to tell about it." Her gaze flicked back to Thomas. He sat still, elbows resting on his knees, saying nothing. Not a plea, not a protest, just watching her like a man studying weather he can't control. Callahan lowered his voice. "We're running out of time. Eleanor, if we don't find water within the week..." He didn't finish. He didn't have to. Eleanor's mind raced. She'd spent 5 years building walls inside herself, stone by stone, to keep his face, his voice, and that day out of her life. Now the drought had kicked those walls down in a single afternoon. Thomas finally spoke, his voice low, rough from disuse. "I'll take you there, but I don't ride in chains, and I don't go without you." The room went still. Callahan frowned. "Why her?" Thomas's gaze didn't move from Eleanor. "Because she knows I'm telling the truth when I say I never meant for John Price to die." The name hit her like a thrown stone. She felt her stomach tighten, her throat close. "You don't get to say his name," she said, her voice sharp. "I just did," he answered quietly. Callahan stepped in. "Eleanor, I wouldn't ask if it wasn't desperate. The Red Mesa's no place for one man, especially not hauling a prisoner. He says he'll only lead us if you ride along." She wanted to refuse God, how she wanted to, but the image of the well's low water line rose in her mind. The cracked lips of the children playing in the street, the old horses standing under the scant shade of the livery. Pride was a fine thing, but you couldn't drink it. "You trust me with him?" she asked Callahan. "I trust you more than I trust anyone," he said. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "And if I say no, then we watch this town die." Callahan said simply. Silence stretched, broken only by the tick of the jail's wall clock. Thomas sat without moving, but she could feel the weight of his attention on her like heat from a fire. At last, she exhaled through her nose. "If I go," she said, "I make the rules. One wrong move and I'll put a bullet in you myself." Thomas's mouth curved into the faintest shadow of a smile. "Fair enough." Callahan unlocked the cell door. The metal groaning, the sound carried through the still air like a warning bell. Eleanor turned on her heel and stepped into the sun. The heat hit her face like a slap. She didn't look back. but she heard the door open and the scuff of Thomas Reed's boots behind. Hurt somewhere in her gut, a voice whispered that this ride into the Red Mesa was going to cost her more than she knew how to pay. The next morning broke without a hint of dew. The sun rose pale and merciless over Willow Creek, turning the dust into gold for a brief, deceptive moment before the heat swallowed it. Eleanor stood beside the hitching post in front of the jail, her mare saddled and ready. She wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, a light duster over her dress, and a holstered Colt on her hip. Thomas emerged, with Sheriff Callahan at his side, unshackled but with his hands loosely tied by a length of rawhide. He looked at the mare, then at Eleanor, but said nothing. She mounted without waiting for him, turning her gaze down Main Street where a few early risers watched from shaded porches. News traveled fast in Willow Creek by now. Half the town knew she was riding out with the man she'd once called a murderer. They set off north, the sheriff riding point, Eleanor between them, Thomas bringing up the rear. The desert opened quickly beyond the last fence line, rolling stretches of sagebrush and dry washes, punctuated by jagged red butts in the distance. The air shimmered with heat, the horizon wavering like a mirage. For the first 2 hours, no one spoke. The only sounds were the creak of saddle leather and the occasional call of a hawk circling overhead. Finally, Thomas's voice came from behind her. "Why'd you agree?" She kept her eyes forward. "Because the town needs water. That's not the whole of it," he said. "It's all you're getting." They passed an old windmill, its blades still as death. Beyond it, the land sloped into a narrow arroyo where the shade brought a brief, blessed coolness. They dismounted to let the horses drink from a shallow pool that had nearly dried up. Thomas crouched beside the water, cupping it in his hands. "Won't last another week. That's why we're here," Callahan said sharply. Back in the saddle, they rode into rougher country. The trail narrowed between two towering cliffs of red sandstone, the air growing cooler as the sun's angle shifted. Thomas slowed his horse, glancing up at the cliff tops. Eleanor noticed. "Expecting company, not the kind you want," he replied. Moments later, the crack of a rifle echoed off the stone. A bullet struck the dirt between Thomas's horse and Eleanor's. The animals reared, and Callahan barked. Down, they slid from their saddles, taking cover behind boulders. Another shot rang out, this one chipping stone inches from Eleanor's head. Thomas peered around the rock. "It's the Miller gang. I took something from them a few years back. They've been waiting for me to come through this pass." "What did you take?" Eleanor demanded. "Their pride," he said with a faint smile. Then his tone hardened. "We've got to move before they circle round." Callahan covered them with his rifle while Thomas led the horses through a narrow cleft in the rock. They scrambled up a dry wash littered with loose stone, emerging into open ground half a mile from the pass. The shooting had stopped, but the silence felt just as dangerous. They didn't slow until the butts hid the pass from view. Callahan's face was grim. "They know we're headed into the mesa. We'll have to keep moving." As the day wore on, the heat pressed down harder. Eleanor's shirt clung to her back, and her canteen grew lighter with each sip. She caught Thomas watching her more than once, not with the cold detachment she remembered from the trial, but with something unreadable. By late afternoon, they reached the outer rim of the Red Mesa. The cliffs here rose in layers of crimson and gold, carved by centuries of wind. Narrow trails snaked up the rock faces, and somewhere beyond lay the spring Thomas promised. They made camp in the shadow of a cliff, where the air cooled quickly as the sun dipped low. Callahan took first watch, sitting by the fire with his rifle across his knees. Eleanor unrolled her bedroll on the opposite side of the flames from Thomas. For a long while, neither spoke. The fire crackled softly, throwing light onto the sandstone walls. Finally, Thomas said, "Your husband was a good man." Her head snapped up. "You should know the truth before we reach that spring," he said quietly. "John's death wasn't the way they told it." Her hands clenched around the blanket. "You had your chance to speak in court. They wouldn't have listened, and you wouldn't have believed me. You're right about one thing," she said coldly, then turned onto her side, ending the conversation. But long after she closed her eyes, his words circled in her mind like a vulture over empty land. The next morning, they broke camp before the first blush of dawn. The Red Mesa loomed ahead in jagged silhouettes, the cliffs catching fire with the rising sun. The air was cooler here, but dry as an old bone. The path narrowed into a winding trail between sheer walls of crimson sandstone. Eleanor rode close behind Callahan, her eyes scanning the cliffs. The events of yesterday, the Miller gang. The rifle shots had left her nerves sharp as a knife's edge. Thomas brought up the rear again, riding with the relaxed posture of a man who'd spent his life in the saddle, though she could feel his gaze on her now and then. They entered a canyon so narrow that their voices bounced back at them in soft echoes. Somewhere high above, a raven called, its cry lingering unnaturally long in the still air. "This is the Canyon of Echoes," Thomas said. "You hear anything that sounds like footsteps, might not be yours." Eleanor frowned. "Bandits, or worse," he said, and didn't elaborate. The walls of the canyon rose higher, blotting out most of the morning light. Cool shadows wrapped around them, but the sense of being watched grew stronger. Twice, Eleanor thought she saw movement. On the ledges, just a flicker of shadow, gone before she could point it out. Then, the smell hit her. It was faint at first, stale water mixed with something metallic. As they rounded a bend, the trail widened into a small basin where a pool of water sat in the center, its surface coated in a thin film. A mule carcass lay half submerged at the far edge. Callahan cursed under his breath. "Poisoned, someone's. Making sure nothing drinks here." Thomas dismounted, crouching beside the pool. He touched the water with his fingertips, then wiped them on his trousers. "This is deliberate. Means someone doesn't want us reaching the spring." Eleanor's stomach tightened. "The Millers?" "Could be," Thomas said, "or someone else with a stake in keeping Willow Creek dry." They pressed on, leaving the poisoned pool behind. The trail grew steeper, forcing them to lead the horses by hand. Eleanor's legs burned with the climb, and she could hear Thomas's boots crunching in rhythm behind her. At a narrow choke point in the canyon, Callahan halted and raised a hand. He pointed to the ground, fresh tracks, human, heading the same direction they were, not more than a day old. "Looks like we've got company," Callahan said quietly. Thomas scanned the walls. "We're close to the upper mesa. If they're ahead of us, they might be waiting." They moved slower now, each step deliberate. The sun had risen high enough to throw thin spears of light into the canyon, illuminating dust motes that swirled with every breath of wind. Then, without warning, a voice called out from above, "Well, if it ain't Thomas Reed, the man who thinks he can cheat death twice." Eleanor jerked her head up. A man stood on a ledge 30 feet above, rifle in hand. His face was half hidden by a dusty bandana, but his eyes were cold and amused. "Miller," Thomas said flatly. The man laughed. "I hear you're leading a rescue party for your precious little town." "Shame if someone interrupted." More figures appeared along the ledges, rifles glinting in the sun. They had them surrounded. Callahan stepped forward. "We're not looking for trouble." "Then you should." "We stayed home," Miller cut in. Eleanor's hand went to her Colt, but Thomas's voice stopped her. "Don't," he said quietly. "They'll shoot before you clear leather." Miller's gaze shifted to Eleanor, and his grin widened. "Well, now, who's this?" "Don't tell me Thomas has found himself a lady friend." "She's not," Thomas began, but Eleanor's glare cut him off. Miller leaned on his rifle. "Tell you what, you give me Reed here, and the rest of you can walk away. I'll even let you keep the horses." Eleanor felt every eye on her. She glanced at Callahan, whose jaw was set like stone. Thomas stood still, not pleading, not resisting. The choice pressed on her like the weight of the cliffs. "If you want him," she said evenly, "you'll have to come down and take him." Miller's smile faltered just enough for her to notice. Then he laughed again, a harsh, echoing sound. "Suit yourself. Let's see how far you get before the sun kills you." The gang melted back into the rocks, disappearing as quickly as they'd appeared. The canyon was silent again, but the air felt heavier. Callahan exhaled slowly. "They'll be following us now. Then we move faster," Thomas said, mounting up as they pushed deeper into the mesa. Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that the real danger wasn't Miller's gang, it was whatever truth Thomas was carrying, and the moment he decided to drop it on her. By the time the sun began to sink behind the cliffs, the shadows in the Red Mesa stretched long and jagged. They found a narrow alcove sheltered from the wind and made camp. The air cooled fast, but the heat of the day still clung to the rock, like a memory that wouldn't fade. Callahan went to scout a short distance away, leaving Eleanor and Thomas alone by the fire. She sat cross-legged, sharpening a small skinning knife, her eyes fixed on the sparks drifting into the night. Thomas leaned back against a boulder, arms loosely crossed, watching her in silence. "You've been looking at me all day," she said finally, not glancing up, "trying to figure out how much of you is the same as 5 years ago." He replied, "And you're sharper now. Harder, but not colder, not yet." She set the knife down. "What do you want from me, Thomas?" "The truth," he said, "and for you to hear mine." Her jaw tightened. "Your truth got my husband killed." His gaze didn't waver. "John's death wasn't my doing, and if you'd known what he was involved in, you might see it differently." Eleanor's heart thudded once hard. "What are you talking about?" Thomas glanced toward the dark beyond the firelight, as if weighing whether to speak. "Back then, I was tracking a group, smuggling stolen army rifles through the territory. John, he was mixed up in it." "That's a lie." She snapped. "It's not. He was running those guns to sell in Mexico. I tried to pull him out before it got bad, but the Millers caught wind. The night he died. He wasn't an innocent man caught in a crossfire. He was there to close a deal." Her breath came quick and shallow. "You expect me to believe that now, after all this time? I expect you to think about why the Millers are still after me. If I'd killed him out of spite, why would they care?" She wanted to deny it outright, but the certainty she'd carried for 5 years wavered. "Just slightly. You could have told me," she whispered. "You wouldn't have listened," he said softly. Before she could answer, a rustle from the darkness made them both turn. Callahan emerged, his expression grim. "We've got a problem. The Millers are camped less than a mile north. If we head for the spring in the morning, they'll be right on us." Thomas stood, grabbing his hat. "Then we move tonight." The moon was only a thin sliver, but the starlight painted the cliffs in silver and shadow. They packed quickly, leading the horses through narrow cuts in the rock. The sound of hooves and boots echoed softly, swallowed by the vastness around them. That at a steep incline, Eleanor's mare slipped, sending a cascade of loose stone clattering down into the darkness. A shout rose in the distance to close. "They heard that," Callahan said sharply. They pushed faster, weaving through jagged spires until they reached a high ledge overlooking a drop of 50 feet. Thomas pointed to a narrow path along the cliff face. "It's risky, but it's the only way without circling back." Callahan went first, leading his horse carefully along the ledge. Eleanor followed, every muscle tense as the drop yawned beside her. Thomas brought up the rear. Halfway across, a rifle cracked. The shot hit the rock near Callahan's feet, sending him stumbling. His horse reared, and in the chaos, the animal's reins snapped free and it bolted down the path. "Go," Callahan shouted. "I'll cover you." Eleanor hesitated. Leaving him meant riding straight into whatever was ahead, but staying meant getting pinned down. Another shot rang out, sparking, off the cliff inches from her head. Thomas's voice cut through the gunfire. "If we don't move now, none of us make it." Gritting her teeth, she pushed forward. Thomas stayed close behind until they rounded the bend and the ledge widened again. They could still hear the echo of shots, but no sign of Callahan. They rode hard for another half hour before stopping in a sheltered hollow. Eleanor swung off her mare, chest heaving. "We have to go back for him." Thomas shook his head. "If he's alive, he'll find us. If he's not, going back won't change that." Her hands balled into fists. "You don't care, do you?" His eyes locked on hers, fierce. "I care enough to get you to that spring before the Millers do. That's the only way any of this matters." Somewhere deep inside, she knew he was right, but the image of Callahan alone on that ledge burned in her mind. They reached the upper rim of the Red Mesa just as the first light of dawn bled into the sky. The air was thin and cool here, carrying the faint scent of juniper. Ahead, a narrow path wound between the towering slabs of stone, leading into a hidden hollow. Somewhere inside lay the spring Thomas had promised, a place Eleanor had begun to think might be nothing more than a desperate story. They moved cautiously. Every shadow felt alive, every whisper of wind like the breath of someone watching. Thomas took the lead now, guiding his mare with quiet confidence, his eyes scanning for movement. Eleanor followed, her Colt loose in its holster. The trail dipped suddenly into a shallow basin, and there it was, the spring. Clear water bubbled from a crack in the rock, spilling into a pool no larger than a wagon bed. The sight of it after days of dust and thirst made Eleanor's chest tighten. She dismounted and knelt, cupping the water in her hands. It was cold, sweet, alive. But the moment was short-lived. A voice called from the rim above. "Well, well, looks like you found it for us." The Millers. Half a dozen figures stepped into view, rifles leveled. Miller himself grinned down at them. "I'll admit, Reed, you're a stubborn son of a gun. But this is where the trail ends." Thomas didn't move. "You want the water? You'll have to take it over our bodies," Miller chuckled. "That can be arranged." The standoff stretched, the morning air taut as a drawn bowstring. Eleanor's mind raced. Fighting here meant certain death. There was no cover, and the Millers had the high ground. She looked at Thomas, saw the faintest flicker of a plan in his eyes. He leaned toward her and spoke low. "The outlet runs under the ridge. There's a second way out. When I move, you run." Before she could argue, he stepped forward, hands raised as if in surrender. "All right, Miller, you win. But you'll have to come down here to finish it." Miller sneered, but the bait was too sweet. He motioned to men to descend the slope. The moment their boots hit the basin floor, Thomas moved fast as a whip crack. He slammed the first man with his shoulder, sending him sprawling into the pool, then spun and drove an elbow into the second man's jaw. "Now, Eleanor," he shouted. She bolted toward the rock wall where a narrow crevice gaped, ducking inside. She found a low tunnel where cold water trickled over her boots. Behind her, gunfire erupted sharp, deafening in the enclosed space. She ran, twisting through the dark, until light appeared ahead. The tunnel spilled her out onto a narrow ledge overlooking a steep drop. Below, the land opened into a dry wash that wound toward the distant hills. She scrambled down, her palms scraping. Raw on the rock. A moment later, Thomas emerged from the tunnel, limping but upright. A dark stain spread on his sleeve, but he waved her forward. "Go." They ran, the sound of shouts and gunfire fading behind them. The wash carried them farther from the mesa with each step. By the time they stopped to breathe, the sun was high, and the Millers were nowhere in sight. Eleanor turned to him. "You could have left me back there." "Could have," he said, catching his breath. "Didn't." She looked at the blood on his arm. "You're hurt, just a graze." He glanced toward the horizon where Willow Creek lay unseen. "That spring will keep the town alive. You should go back, tell them where it is, and you." He shrugged. "Some folks won't want me there, no matter what I've done. I'll stay clear." She hesitated. For 5 years, she'd carried a picture of him as a killer. Now, standing in the harsh light of morning, she saw something else, someone who had chosen, again and again, to give her a way out. "You could come back with me," she said quietly. His eyes softened. "Maybe one day. For now, you ride on." Eleanor mounted her mare, the weight of the choice pressing on her. She could feel the pull of the town, of safety and familiarity, but she also felt the strange, unsteady freedom of the open trail. She looked back at Thomas one last time. "Thank you." He tipped his hat. "Safe travels, Eleanor Price." Then she turned her horse toward the horizon, the wind tugging at her hat brim. The spring was behind her, the future ahead uncertain, untamed, but hers to claim.